When you ignore a narcissist entirely, what disappears first is not their confidence, not their bravado, not even their anger. It is their sense of psychological control. Narcissists do not relate to people in the ordinary sense. They regulate themselves through reaction. Every response, whether it is admiration, frustration, fear, or even silence that still carries emotional tension, gives them a point of orientation. It tells them where they stand. It reassures them that they still matter, that they still have leverage. When you stop engaging completely, that orientation vanishes. At first, this loss feels disorienting to them. They replay conversations in their mind, searching for the moment where control slipped. They wonder what they miscalculated. They test the silence internally, expecting it to break, because in their experience, it always has. People usually return. People usually react. Ignoring them entirely is not something their psychological structure is designed to tolerate for long. Without access to your attention, they lose their ability to shape the emotional environment. They can no longer provoke you into anger, pull you into explanation, or lure you into justification. And without those reactions, they cannot stabilize their own inner state. What emerges instead is agitation, restlessness, a quiet panic that has nothing to do with love or loss, but everything to do with losing influence. Control was never about connection. It was about regulation. This is why your silence feels so loud to them. It strips away their usual tools. There is nothing to push against, nothing to correct, nothing to dominate. The absence of feedback becomes unbearable because it forces them to sit alone with emotions they normally outsource to others. Uncertainty, insignificance, and the fear of being irrelevant. You are no longer playing your assigned role in their psychological system, and that destabilizes everything. And here is the part that matters most for you to understand. This collapse of control is not something you cause through cruelty or revenge. It happens because you stepped out of a dynamic that required your participation to function. You didn't attack, you didn't argue, you didn't explain, you simply removed access. And in doing so, you reclaimed something essential, your autonomy. When control disappears, power shifts and silence becomes the boundary they cannot cross. After the initial shock of being shut out, something else begins to happen. The narcissist doesn't usually rush back in openly, because open rejection would confirm the loss of control they're trying desperately to deny. Instead, they shift strategies. They move sideways. They test the door without knocking. This is where indirect contact begins, subtle enough to preserve their pride, but intentional enough to provoke a response. You might notice sudden visibility where there was none before. A carefully timed appearance, a reminder of shared history, a symbolic gesture that seems innocent on the surface. None of this is random. It's designed to stir curiosity, nostalgia, or guilt without requiring them to risk direct exposure. They're not reaching out to reconnect. They're checking whether they still exist in your emotional field. What's important to understand is that these indirect signals are not signs of growth or reflection. They are probes. Small psychological pings sent out to see if you will turn your head, click, reply, or even think about responding. Any reaction, even confusion or irritation, tells them the channel is still open. Silence, on the other hand, tells them something far more unsettling, that they are no longer central. When these subtle attempts fail, the discomfort intensifies. The narcissist may repeat the behavior, escalate it slightly, or change its form. The goal remains the same: to reestablish relevance without risking rejection. This is why ignoring them entirely feels so unnatural at first. You were conditioned to respond, to explain, to acknowledge, but every non-response reinforces a truth they are struggling to accept. You are no longer available for psychological extraction. And here is the quiet power in this moment. By not engaging, you are not punishing them. You are refusing to participate in a pattern that required your emotional labor to sustain itself. Their indirect attempts only reveal how dependent they were on access, not how strong their attachment ever was. When even subtle reach fails, silence stops being a tactic and becomes a verdict. When the indirect attempts no longer work and the silence remains intact, something deeper begins to unravel inside them. The narcissist's self-image, which once appeared solid and confident, starts to fracture quietly from within. This is because that image was never self-sustaining. It was held together by reflection, by being seen, responded to, and emotionally registered by others. When you remove that mirror, the structure loses its anchor. At first, they may inflate themselves internally, reminding themselves of how important they are, how desirable, how superior. This isn't confidence, it's compensation. It's a psychological effort to patch over a growing sense of instability. But inflation never lasts without reinforcement. Without your attention, there is nothing to confirm the story they are telling themselves. The mind begins to wobble between grandiosity and doubt, and that oscillation is deeply uncomfortable. In this space, questions they usually avoid start to surface. Not reflective questions, not accountable ones, but unsettling ones. Why didn't you react? Why didn't you chase? Why didn't you need them? These questions strike at the core of their identity because they challenge a belief they rely on for emotional survival, that they are indispensable. Silence doesn't argue against that belief. It simply refuses to support it, and that refusal is devastating. What makes this stage particularly destabilizing is that they cannot resolve it through performance. There is no audience, no one to impress, no one to correct. The internal voice grows louder, and without external validation to drown it out, feelings they have long suppressed begin to leak through. Emptiness, insecurity, and the quiet fear of being unremarkable. These emotions are not processed, they are resisted. But resistance requires energy, and over time, that energy runs thin. From the outside, you may never see this fracture. Narcissists are skilled at presenting coherence even when it's collapsing internally, but the absence of your attention removes a key pillar holding their self-image in place. You become the missing reflection they can't replace, and that absence forces them into a psychological confrontation they cannot control. When the mirror is gone, the cracks no longer stay hidden. As the internal fractures grow and the silence remains unbroken, the narcissist reaches for something familiar, a rewritten story. When they can no longer control the situation emotionally, they attempt to control it narratively. This is not about truth or understanding. It's about preserving a sense of self that feels threatened. If reality cannot be managed, it must be reinterpreted. In this revised version, they were never ignored. They were the one who stepped back. They weren't displaced, they chose distance. Or, in another version, they were deeply wronged, misunderstood, abandoned without cause. The details shift depending on what protects the ego most effectively in that moment. What matters is not consistency, but emotional survival. The story becomes a shield against the unbearable idea that someone simply stopped engaging and moved on. This narrative is often rehearsed internally before it is ever shared outwardly. They repeat it until it feels solid, until doubt quiets just enough to function. If others are brought into it, it's not for clarity, it's for confirmation. Agreement from others becomes a substitute for the validation they no longer receive from you. Each nod, each sympathetic response helps stabilize a self-image that is otherwise slipping. But here's the paradox. The more extreme the rewritten story becomes, the further it drifts from reality. And the further it drifts, the more fragile it gets. Maintaining a false narrative requires constant reinforcement. It cannot rest, it cannot be questioned. Your silence threatens it simply by existing, because silence doesn't cooperate with their version of events. You are not there to argue, defend, or react in a way that would anchor the story. That absence leaves gaps they can't fully close. This is why some narcissists appear cold, dismissive, or strangely triumphant after being ignored. What you're seeing isn't peace, it's posture. It's a performance designed to convince themselves as much as anyone else that they remain in control. But beneath this, at surface, is the ongoing effort to outrun a truth they cannot integrate, that someone exercised autonomy without explanation. You don't need to correct the story. You don't need to defend yourself. Their narrative exists because your silence made reality undeniable. When truth can't be controlled, it gets rewritten, but silence still tells it. When the story no longer stabilizes them, and the silence continues, their behavior often begins to change in visible ways. What once was calculated becomes exaggerated. What was subtle becomes performative. This isn't confidence returning, it's compensation escalating. Deprived of direct access to your attention, they attempt to manufacture relevance elsewhere, hoping it somehow reaches you indirectly. You may notice sudden displays of success, confidence, or happiness that seem unusually intense or poorly timed. Achievements are announced louder than necessary. Emotions are expressed more dramatically. Even indifference can be exaggerated into a performance. None of this is accidental. These behaviors are attempts to provoke recognition, to signal value, to restore a sense of being seen without having to engage directly. It's an external scramble to repair an internal imbalance. At times, this can swing in the opposite direction. Instead of bravado, there may be irritation, bitterness, or erratic emotional shifts. The absence of emotional supply creates instability, and instability leaks. Without a consistent audience to regulate themselves against, their inner state lacks rhythm. What you are witnessing is not strength unraveling into weakness. It is dependence exposed by deprivation. What makes this phase particularly revealing is how disconnected it is from you personally. These displays are not about reconciliation or understanding. They are about self-soothing through attention, any attention. The target can change, the audience can change, but the need remains the same. That's why even public success or admiration doesn't seem to settle them for long. The relief is brief because it's not addressing the core loss. The loss of psychological access to someone who no longer responds. Your continued indifference strips these performances of their payoff. Without your reaction, the emotional return on their effort is minimal. Over time, this creates exhaustion. It's hard to sustain intensity when it doesn't land where it was intended. The more they perform, the clearer it becomes that the behavior is about filling a void, not expressing fulfillment. And this is where clarity matters for you. None of this requires a response. You are not responsible for managing the fallout of a dynamic you stepped away from. Their escalation is not a sign that you should re-engage. It is proof that disengagement worked. When performance replaces connection, silence becomes the only honest response. Eventually, after the strategies fail, the stories thin out and the performances lose their audience. The narcissist is facing something they cannot negotiate with or manipulate: your autonomy. This is the moment that cuts deepest, not because it is dramatic, but because it is final. They are forced to confront a truth their entire psychological framework resists: that another person can step out of their influence and remain unmoved. This confrontation doesn't arrive as insight or growth. It arrives as a quiet internal reckoning. They realize that no amount of intensity, charm, anger, or narrative control can reach you anymore. And that realization destabilizes a belief they have relied on for a lifetime, that they are central, necessary, and inescapable. Your silence proves otherwise without ever having to say a word. What makes this stage so unsettling for them is that there is no action left to take. Control requires engagement, manipulation requires access, and you have removed both. They cannot argue their way back into relevance. They cannot perform their way into your awareness. They are confronted with a boundary that does not bend, because it isn't enforced through force, it exists through choice. For some, this moment triggers rage, resentment, or contempt, directed inward or outward. For others, it produces a hollow withdrawal, a retreat masked as indifference. But regardless of the external reaction, the internal truth remains the same. They are no longer the axis around which your emotional world turns, and that reality cannot be reversed by tactics or time. This is where your role truly ends. You are not there to witness their reckoning, to validate their pain, or to interpret their behavior. Your silence is not a message meant for them. It is a decision made for you. It marks the point where engagement gives way to self-respect, and reaction gives way to freedom. And in that freedom, something irreversible happens. You stop being someone they can reach, and you become someone they must accept they've lost. When autonomy is undeniable, control becomes irrelevant.